Welcome to the Global Roundtable organized by the Global Foundation for Democracy and Development. Today we are talking to Mr. Mark Weisbrot. He is a co-director of the Center for the Economic and Research Policy. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
It's great to have you here with us, and let me just introduce you briefly to our audiences. In addition to being the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C., Mark Weisbrot is also the author of the book Failed: What the Experts Got Wrong About the Global Economy, and also a co-author with Dean Baker of Social Security, the Phony Crisis, and has written numerous research papers on economic policy. Mr. Weisbrot also writes a regular column on economic and policy issues that is distributed to over 500 newspapers by the Tribune Content Agency. His opinion pieces have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, and almost every major U.S. newspaper, as well as in Brazil's largest newspaper, Folha de Sao Paulo. He appears regularly on national and local television and radio programs and is also president of Just Foreign Policy, an independent organization dedicated to reforming U.S. foreign policy by mobilizing and organizing the broad majority of Americans who want a foreign policy based on diplomacy, law, and cooperation. So, Mark, let's talk about your recent book. And could you give us a little bit of an overview what you have expressed in your book? I understand you have expressed some non-orthodox points and views and different theories, different ways of seeing what's happening on the international arena.
Sure. Well, you know, a lot of it is pretty well known and just not talked about all that much. Most of it is about long-term economic failures and the changes that have taken place in the global economy over the last couple of decades. So, for example, you know, in Latin America, you had the left in Latin America went from governing zero countries in 1998 to practically the majority of the region over the next decade. And I think a lot of people don't realize that that was a response to one of the worst long-term economic failures in modern history. You had these 2 decades from 1980 to 2000 where income per person in the whole region barely grew.
So what would you say? What caused this failure?
Well, I would say it was a whole set of policies, failed policies, which I, use the word neoliberalism in the book. I mean, the governments gave up on the development strategies that they had in the past, which were often state-led. They had overly tight fiscal and monetary policies, sometimes very much at the wrong time in the so they would shrink the economy when it was falling already in recession. You know, in the 1980s, they were squeezed for external debt payments enormously, and this led to balance of payments crises and other problems. And so it was a whole set of bad policies over a very long period of time. And then, just to give you the numbers, from 1960 to 1980, the average income per person, or GDP per person, grew by over 90%. And then from 2000 to 2000, when these other policies were dominant, it grew by 5.7% total for the whole 20 years. So it was almost no growth at all. And this was the worst performed economic failure in more than 100 years.
And then the change happened in Latin America. So how would you define the change?
Well, I think it was overwhelmingly positive. I mean, one thing you can see, first of all, their growth picked up considerably, but also poverty fell. Poverty had been rising from 1980 to 2002. It actually was higher in 2002 at about 44% for the region. And then it fell to 28% by 2013. So, and that was a result of restoring economic growth, increasing employment, and a lot of government policies as well. You know, the Brazilian government, for example, doubled the real minimum wage, a similar increase in Bolivia. You had large increases in public investment. In Ecuador, in Argentina, you had a huge reduction of poverty. And they, of course, had to change a whole set of economic policies because they were stuck in a depression.
So you mentioned that these poverty alleviation policies haven't been really publicly so much discussed or appreciated. Is that something that will stay? I mean, the policies and the attitude towards them, or is it changing?
Well, I think people will, well, obviously the region is moving to the right now, and there's a kind of counter-reform movement with the right-wing president in Argentina. And of course the impeachment, which I would agree with Dilma, is a coup in Brazil. And so you are seeing some setbacks. You know, the United States is also a big part of the picture, and the IMF as well. One of the big things, and I have a chapter on this, that happened in the 21st century, is the IMF lost most of its power over middle-income countries. And that was especially true in Latin America. You know, when Lula was running for president in 2002, he sat down with his opponents and the IMF, and the IMF basically told them what their economic policies were going to be for the next couple of years, no matter who won the election. And that was true in a lot of situations in that region. And so the reclaiming of national economic sovereignty was a huge part of the success. In Bolivia, they renationalized when Evo Morales was elected. You know, first of all, it was kind of the end of apartheid, like in South Africa. You had an indigenous president for an indigenous majority country.
A revolution.
Yeah, where they were marginalized and excluded before he was elected. But one thing he did right away in May of 2006 was to renationalize the hydrocarbons industry. And the government's revenue from hydrocarbons multiplied 7 times, from 731 million to about 5 billion. Some of that was price increases, but most of it wasn't. It was from the government, the central government, taking control over it. And so there were a lot of these things that took place and wouldn't have been possible if not for the kind of second independence of the region.
So do you think it is going to be sustained and will progress, or we are really veering in some kind of reversal or different direction right now?
Well, there are definite reversals right now, but I don't think they can roll the clock back, really rolling it back. Also, they made institutional changes at the regional level. You know, they created UNASUR,
yes.
Also the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, the CELAC, where you have every country is a member of that except for the United States and Canada.
It's
and that
a different model than the Organization of American States.
Yeah.
And then the question is, are they complementary? Are they competing? What's your point?
Well, I think they created that because of what happened in 2009, where you had a military coup in Honduras, and the United States government manipulated and sidelined the OAS in order to consolidate that coup and legitimate a coup government and legitimate elections under a dictatorship that no one else recognized. The OAS didn't recognize it. The European Union wouldn't send observers. And yet the United States insisted that this was going to be the new government of Honduras. And Hillary Clinton even wrote in her book that she helped make sure that the democratically elected government would not be able to return. That was a turning point, I think, for Latin America, because they were giving the new president, Obama, a chance to do something different, and he didn't. And that's why I think they moved in this direction of more independent foreign policy and regional policy.
So would you say that Obama's presidency hasn't really helped to foster better relationships with the Latin American countries, or it fell flat to expectations there were?
Yeah, I think it was quite terrible. I mean, except for the opening to Cuba at the end,
right,
which, you know, still has a long way to go. It was really, it was in many ways worse than even Bush's policy. But he got much better press. And so you don't see, the governments all knew exactly what was going on. And then again, that's why they created CELAC. That's why they fought back against them on the coup in Honduras, on Paraguay, on a whole number of issues when they tried to expand military bases in Colombia.
Right.
They fought back against that. But because Obama got very much better media coverage, most people don't see.
Publicly, it doesn't look so bad.
It doesn't look as bad, yeah.
So is there anything for us to look forward to, maybe in the near future, regarding the U.S.-Latin America relationships with the forthcoming elections?
Well, I think that what you're seeing now is a setback. Part of it is, of course, the economy. The Latin American economy as a region, didn't grow last year, and it's projected to shrink about 0.5% this year. But I think that will recover. Part of that is cyclical. Part of it is the global economy. Part of it is a set of economic mistakes that I talk about in the book as well. That governments made even since the global economy slowed. But I do think that these will be fixed, because I think what's different now as compared to these lost decades of the last 2 decades of the 20th century is that they have sovereignty. So a government that doesn't, and they have democracy, and because you can't really have democracy without
So you would say
sovereignty.
the countries, the governments, the economies have been strengthened institutionally and politically?
That's right. And most importantly, if the governments that don't deliver, and I think the right-wing governments won't. I don't think the government in Brazil is going to deliver. Look at the cabinet that he just picked, and somebody with a 2% approval rating. I mean, I think they will get voted out, which in the past was much more difficult.
So this is good news for Latin American democracy.
I think that's right. I think they didn't have. I mean, you don't have real democracy when you have the IMF telling you, Bolivia was under IMF agreements for 20 years straight. And when Evo was elected, the income per person there was less than it was 27 years prior. So that's the kind of long-term failure. I don't think what you're seeing now is going to be a long-term failure like that. It's a setback, but I think that having gotten used to the progress under left governments, that's going to be the future.
And demanded by the population.
Yes.
So let's jump quickly to China, and although it's on the other side of the world, it's very closely linked to Latin America. There is a slowdown in Chinese economy. There is also a fall in the common goods prices. So on the other hand, there are also elections that just happened in Taiwan. There is a new president taking office on May 20th. How is all this going to affect Latin America?
Well, the slowdown in China has affected Latin America. I think it's much exaggerated here, though. The story you see in Washington is that these left governments benefited from a commodities boom, and then the commodities prices fell because of the slowdown in China. And actually, China gets a little too much blame, too. I mean, look at Europe. The European Union as a whole is the largest economy in the world. And the Eurozone just caught up with its GDP of 8 years ago just now. So that has slowed the economy, the world economy, much more than China has. But nonetheless, this China slowdown is part of it. But it's not the main story. In Brazil, for example, Brazil's in a deep recession now, and a little bit of that was caused by the slowdown in China and the slowing demand for commodities, but very little of it. And the same is true.
What would you attribute then the rest of the slowdown?
Well, I think in Brazil, most of the slowdown is a result of what I would say were mistaken government policies, responding to the slowdown with pro-cyclical policies. That is, policies, they sharply cut public investment, tightened the budget, raised interest rates, tightened credit. All of those things, I think, pushed the economy.
Would you say it's true for all the rest of Latin American countries? Because there is this constant statement that basically the growth that has declined in Latin America is due to commodity prices going down and to China slowdown.
But that really isn't true, and it wasn't true on the upswing either. It wasn't driven by commodities. You know, they always say that Argentina was soybeans. If you actually look at their national income accounts, and you look at the expansion from 2003 to 2008, when the 2002 to 2008, when the economy grew by over 60%, you know, that was very little. Only 12% of that growth was due to exports at all, and less than half of that to commodities. So it was very, what the commodities boom did is it helped these governments to avoid balance of payments crises. This is a problem for any developing country. You have to have enough hard currency reserve so you don't run into trouble. Once you run into trouble, you know, it can cause all kinds of problems. You know, in Venezuela, for example, you have an inflation depreciation spiral where you have a black market and the currency, the dollar is 100 times more expensive than the official rate, and that contributes to inflation, and then inflation pushes more people into the black market, and that keeps going. You had that in the 80s and 90s in other countries. So that's a problem there. Argentina had a problem, ran into trouble in the last few years because they couldn't borrow on international markets. And then again, you had the horrible influence of the United States, where this New York judge made this ridiculous decision to take all of their creditors hostage for the vulture funds. So that's where that's the only way really in which, or the main way in which the commodities prices really made a difference in Latin America, was they allowed these governments to maintain steady balance of payments surpluses, so they didn't have to worry about those kinds of crises.
And the rest was due to government policies?
Changes in government policy, yeah, I think those were the biggest things that drove it.
So let me conclude by the last question, which everybody keeps asking daily. Are we out of the 2008 recession? Is another recession coming? Is it going to implode, explode? What is there awaiting?
You mean in the United States?
In the United States and then
the
world as well, because...
Yes. Well, in the United States, for sure. I mean, our recession lasted 18 months. From December 2008 is when 2007 is when it started. And let's see, it was December 2008 to the middle of 2009. And after that, since then, the U.S. economy has been growing. And so, we still have a couple million people who should have jobs right now and don't, that are not included in the
and it's felt strongly in some areas of the country, much more than others.
And that's why you see a lot of the discontent in the campaign.
Right.
And also the average household income is still down from 10 or 15 years ago. And so, but I don't see the U.S. falling back into recession. The world economy is a little shakier, partly because of the Eurozone. That's, I have 2 chapters in the book about that. I mean, that's real long-term policy-driven economic failure. They pushed, they had a recession just like ours, about the same length. It was 5 quarters. And then they got another 2 years of recession just from their own bad policies that we didn't have here, even though this was the epicenter of the...
So you're saying that the European Union economy is actually contracting world's economy more than maybe the slowdown of China or what's happening in the States right now?
Certainly in the last 8 years, they've contributed much more to the weakness in the global economy. China actually contributed enormously during the world recession. They were responsible for most of the growth in the world economy.
Right.
Because they had a very positive counter-cyclical policy, even though their exports fell enormously. And so the Chinese slowdown, I think, is hurting right now. The European, even though the Europe is recovering, it's a very weak recovery with mass unemployment. And the U.S. economy is, it's kind of slow too. It only grew by about 1% over the last half year at an annual rate. And so there are, like the IMF in April last month they lowered their
Right.
forecast for the world
The
economy
spring meeting.
because there are weaknesses. But I don't see any big disaster looming. There's nothing like what you had in 2006 and 7, where you had this gigantic real estate bubbles and things that were just ready to burst and cause havoc, and everybody who was really, which wasn't a lot of people, a lot of economists unfortunately, but those of us who were paying attention knew that was going to happen. It was just a
Right,
question of
right.
when. We're not facing anything like that
Well,
right now.
that gives us a sigh of relief then. Thank you, Mark, so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching the Global Roundtable organized by the Global Foundation for Democracy and Development. Today we have talked to Mr. Mark Weisbrot, co-director of the Center for Policy and Economic Research in Washington, D.C.